Hello, everyone. My name is Lionel Sander from Pembroke Publishers, and it's great to have you here this evening. Before we get started, I would just like you to know that Pembroke Publishers' head office is situated upon traditional territories of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of Scugog, Hiawatha First Nation, Alderville First Nation, and the Métis Nation. The treaty covering this area of land in Toronto, Ontario, is collectively known as the Williams Treaty of 1923. And I wish to recognize the significant contributions of Indigenous peoples across this land. We seek a new relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, one based in honor and deep respect. It's now my honor to introduce our author and presenter for today, Karen Filewych. Karen is an Edmonton educator, author, and presenter. And if you've been with us, as I mentioned earlier, before we got started in the last 4.5 years, you may have seen one of her presentations before. But yeah, I'd like to also acknowledge that she has more than 25 years of educational experience as an elementary teacher, school administrator, and language arts consultant. Among Karen's books for teachers and administrators are How Do I Get Them to Write?, Free Writing with Purpose, and Literacy Leadership Matters. She is also the senior author of Pearson's Bug Club Morphology. And tonight she is here talking about her new book, Literacy Instruction Matters. Karen enjoys sharing her love of literacy and empowering others through professional development for teachers, writing residencies for students, and consulting work with schools, boards, and publishers. And I know in the past, Karen, we've also talked about hockey, and you might have one better player than the Canucks, but it's all part of it. So Karen, it's great to have you here. I will get your slides going here and pass the virtual mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Lionel. Welcome, everyone, from wherever you happen to be joining us this evening. I do appreciate your time, and we're going to jump right in. As Lionel said, I have been very busy with writing various resources as of late. I was previously with Edmonton Catholic Schools, and I noticed some of you in the chat are from Edmonton Catholic. But about 4 years ago, I resigned because I was doing more and more writing, and I'm doing residencies and PD across the country. As I said, I'm flying to Manitoba on Thursday to spend a day with a school there on Friday. So I've been very busy, and I love every minute of what I'm doing. Now, when I'm creating resources, including the book that you see on the bottom left there, the reason you're here today is Literacy Instruction Matters. I checked with Canada Post, and it is arriving tomorrow, so I don't even have one to hold up for you, but I will have them in my hands, it looks like tomorrow. But that book, as well as my others, I always try to think about you in the classroom. I know how busy teachers are. I was there, I experienced it, I lived it, and I always try to give you practical strategies that are grounded in strong pedagogy and research. And so that is the same with this particular book. Now, I am guessing that you're here today because you recognize how important literacy is when we're thinking about the students in our classroom. And so with that, I want to share this particular quote with you. The limits of your language are the limits of your world. And I'll tell you, nothing taught me this more than a situation I had when I was an assistant principal. One day I had a mom who came into my office in tears. And when I tell this story to students, when I'm doing my writing residencies, I do tell this story. And I say to them, why do you think this mom was in tears on this particular day? And almost without fail, they'll say that they think her child was being bullied. And I say, no, it wasn't anything to do with her child, actually. It was that she herself was illiterate. And she shared this secret with me on this day, a secret that she had held for years and years and years, kept from everyone, including her own children. And I ask students, what do you think she was feeling on this day? And so we talk about the emotion involved. We talk about all of the things that she couldn't do with her kids, but also to function in the world. And this quote always makes me think about that mom and how brave it was for her to come to me on that particular day to share this with me. She was coming for help. The reason she came on this particular day was that a few days prior, one of her children had been diagnosed with a food allergy, and she was terrified. She was terrified in terms of how she was going to protect her own child. When I talk with students about literacy, we want them to see the relevance. We want them to know that we are teaching them to read and to write, not for us, not for to use in the four walls of our classroom, but to use in the world beyond. And when they start to see that relevance, and when I tell them this story, it hasn't occurred to them that there are adults in their midst who may be illiterate. And when I tell that story, it does change their perspective. And when we go forward then, and I'm teaching them particular skills and strategies, it sets the tone for everything else. So given that, I want you to consider these questions, and I hope that you're willing to jump in the chat. I always like it to be interactive. It would be much better if we were in the room together. Obviously, we're not. But consider these questions. Why do we use language? And what is the function of language? What is the first thing that comes to mind for you when you're thinking about language? And I'll just give you a moment to reply in the chat. And I'm jealous. Sandra got her copy already of the book. I guess it helps when you're in Toronto. All right, so we have communication as one of the first responses there, right? So definitely communication. That's usually the first answer I get when I ask these questions. And you might be thinking of other things as well. So we have a few others coming in, right? Communicate to learn, to express our needs, to have those needs met. All of these functions of language are so critical, and that connection and shared experience, right? And just to live in our world. I mean, language helps us to function in the world, but also to experience all the highs and lows of emotion. I wanted to share with you this particular quote that happens to be from the Alberta Program of Studies, our curriculum here in Alberta, but I share this throughout the country. Language is a uniquely structured system that forms the basis for thinking, communicating, and learning. So even though we usually default to thinking about that communication first, what I always want to remind teachers of is that it is necessary for both thinking and learning as well. Now, if you think about the complexity of learning language, in elementary school, here we are teaching our students the complex skills involved in literacy while they're using those same skills in order to learn. And so it's a really interesting dynamic. But when we're thinking about the purpose of language, the purpose of literacy, we have to recognize that it underpins everything we do. So whether you work with elementary age students or whether you work with older students, literacy matters. And I remember at one point in my career, I had always been in primary. I started my career in primary. And then at one point I was kind of asked to go into a grade 6 classroom to teach. And I was terrified. I thought, I don't know what to do in grade 6. And I ended up loving it. But the convincing thing for me, the principal who had asked me to go into that classroom said, all students, regardless of their age, need strong literacy instruction. And that got me. That got me into that classroom. And that really made me think differently about what I was about to do in a grade 6 classroom. And now here I am, and I present often to high school teachers of every discipline about how we can leverage those literacy strategies in our classrooms and how important they are to learning. Now, in 2023, some of you may be familiar with Literacy Leadership Matters. This book was published with the intended audience of principals, assistant principals, literacy leads, consultants, and just to give that really strong foundation for leaders who might not have the background knowledge to lead a literacy school, to lead the literacy instruction going on in their school. And right from this webinar, actually, we had some comments from consultants. I didn't notice if they happened to be in the room, but a few consultants right in this first webinar who said we need a book like this for teachers. And then over the last few years, I guess a year and a bit, I have been, presenting on this particular topic, and that sentiment has come up again and again. We need this book for teachers. And so that leads us to Literacy Instruction Matters and why we're here today. Now, Literacy Instruction Matters mimics the structure, mirrors the structure of Literacy Leadership Matters very intentionally. So if you are a consultant or if you are an administrator, a literacy lead, you can certainly use the Literacy Leadership Matters for yourself, and then the other can be utilized for the teachers. Literacy Instruction Matters is longer, and it goes into more depth with some of those concepts, because it's not just the overview, it's now what do we do about, how do we teach those concepts, what strategies should we be using, and what do those look like in the classroom. Now, when we think about the contents of this book, I just wanted to give you a very, very quick overview. So when I think about practicality grounded in pedagogy, I mean that for the resource, but even for tonight, even though I want it to be informative for you, I'm hoping to give you a few little strategies that you can take away and utilize immediately into your classroom. So when you think about these first sections here, one of the things that I just want to point out is this organizational structure is there to support teachers, whether you are new to the classroom or whether you're just looking to refine your literacy instruction. So the last few chapters that you see here, all the way to encouraging home literacy experiences. Now we're going to talk very, very briefly about each. And we're starting with that introduction, which I entitled, Where Do I Begin? When I was a language arts consultant, this was one of the questions I got the most, whether it was worded exactly that or not. That was the sentiment, like, where do I start? Where do I possibly begin when I'm teaching language arts? And I love this quote by Malala. You'll notice quotes throughout. I actually, on the slide presentation today, these are the quotes that start the chapters of the book. That's what I've included there to guide us a little bit. But when we think about where do I begin, we do have to recognize that the teaching of language arts is very complex. Now, when we think about it compared to other subject areas, it is not a linear process. So we can't teach it in succinct units or, finish one thing, check, and move on to the next. We're also using language to learn language, as I referred to earlier. So it's really, the interconnectedness cannot be underemphasized. Now, we also have to recognize that language learning and the teaching of language is a very well-researched topic or group of topics. And it's hard to keep up to, the constant research that we're hearing about, whether we're, that teacher in the classroom and we're so focused on those 28 kids that are in front of us, it can be hard to, even take the time to be reading the research that's coming in. And if we're a consultant or an administrator in another role, we have so much on our plate that it's not always easy to keep up. The other thing that makes the teaching of language arts especially complex is that we do have many stakeholders who weigh in on this particular subject area. And it's true to some extent in other areas, but definitely we hear the most chatter about it in the media in regards to language arts, because we have, obviously it's relevant to everything else. So that's part of the reason. But we also have, stakeholders, everything from our government to our parents who want to make it known what they believe in this particular area. And so weeding through all that can be sometimes really challenging. What is best practice? What is the research actually telling us? So that all adds to the complexity. Now, when you consider your background knowledge and your own experience in the classroom, it's very interesting when I talk to teachers and I ask how, especially new teachers, do you have any courses on literacy instruction? And I am shocked at the number who say no, who don't have any or very, very limited. The other thing to consider is, are the terms that you see on the screen, are those things that are familiar to you or not? Possibly more and more, and especially as new curriculum is released across the country. For example, I'll just give morphology example. When morphology was introduced into the Alberta curriculum, I was a consultant at the time, and the question that I was getting is, what is morphology? And so, sometimes we're expected to be, teaching these things, and we're learning along the way, right? In order to know what's the best, for our students, but what even is it, and how do I go about teaching it? So from there, we have to consider this, that even though language arts is very complex, to me, it is so rewarding because we absolutely know our students are going to use these skills every day of their lives. And so to me, I find that that's empowering, and, just refreshing to think about that the relevance of this, what we're actually doing with our students. Now, when we're thinking about chapter 1, you'll notice that I'm talking about the environment. And so, the reason I decided to have a chapter like this is because it's so important that we consider the environment when we're planning our language arts classroom, when we're preparing our students to learn throughout the year. And it's true for our youngest learners as early as our preschool and our kindergarten, but it is true all the way up. Now, it's going to look different depending on what grade level, but it is so important. And this, I love this quote too, is the environment, make the environment as important as the curriculum, and they're going to support each other during instruction. And that's absolutely what we want. Now, when I do writing residencies, sometimes what I'll request is that if there is an extra classroom in the school, that I am, situated in that classroom, the students come to me, and it seems to save some time. Now, 2 residencies ago, I had requested that, and I arrived at the school and I go into this classroom. It wasn't the one you see on the screen, but I just used that as an example. But the classroom I was in was beautiful, but it was a science classroom. And so what I noticed was there wasn't, or was it math? One of the two, I'm forgetting, but it wasn't literacy. And so what I noticed is that I didn't have those anchor charts, those supports in place, the alphabet freeze, the alphabet on desks, and that wasn't there to support the students' learning. And so actually after a day or 2 of the residency, we changed gears and I ended up going into the other students' classrooms. And it was just that reminder to me of how important that environment is that we're creating for our students. So all I've done in chapter 1 is we're looking first at the big picture. So thinking about, all of the things you see on the screen there, how we're going to prepare our space. So some people are doing this at the beginning of the year, thinking about setting up their classroom. And for some of you who have been in the same classroom for years and years, it's about what's working and what's not. What do I need to ensure is there that maybe I don't have currently in place? So aside from the big picture, I also have a considerable section on bulletin boards and wall space. And these are critical resources when we're thinking about the students who are learning language in our classrooms. And so some of the, specifics you see there, I go into a lot of detail about what those could look like. And it's important to recognize that our environment is a key component of the literacy learning in our classrooms. And just to throw out a little example, if you think about English language learners in particular, just imagine what it would be like for you learning another language in another country without the visuals in place, right? Those visuals can really support and anchor us, and that's what we want from our classrooms. Now, Chapter 2, we move on to talk about the role of language in our classrooms. And, we know, if we're experienced teachers, we know that learning is talking. It's so important that our students are talking in our classrooms. And so I just wanted to take a moment to talk about the 6 strands of language. So you'll see that I have them paired, right? The listening and the speaking, reading, writing, viewing, and representing. Many of our curriculum across the country will refer to those strands of language in the pairs that you see on the screen. Not all, but many of them do. And the reason that I like looking at them the way that we have them on the screen right now is because we can see the receptive language skills on the left-hand side and then the expressive on the right-hand side. And it's so critical that we recognize that those strands of language are inexplicably intertwined. We can't and shouldn't separate them and teach one without the other. And so what I always think is ironic is that when I was doing this book, and even the previous, I had to separate them in order to make an efficient read. In order for it to be worthwhile for you, I did have to separate them into the various chapters. However, what we need to recognize is how interconnected those strands of language are. And one of the things that I would like to compare it to is if you just imagine that those strands are actors on a stage. And at any given moment, you have one actor who's taking the leading role, and the others are still on stage supporting that lead actor at that moment. And then scene changes, that lead actor now changes, and we do have another focus, but the others are still present. And if we think about that, that ensures that we don't have something disappear, that we're doing a lesson on reading and we're forgetting about writing, or we're doing a lesson on writing, we're forgetting about reading, or we're forgetting about oral language, or any of those pieces. So important that we recognize how those strands intersect and work together all the time. Now, when I thought about how I was going to organize chapter 2, sort of in a couple of different things that I wanted to emphasize here, right? Like talking about the nature of language and how do we leverage language to enhance learning. And that's actually, as I referred to earlier, I actually do a lot of work on that topic now, especially with older students who aren't necessarily teachers who aren't necessarily teaching language arts, but I want them to be able to leverage those skills in their classroom. I also took the opportunity to divide the strands up so that we can see what the listening and speaking, reading, writing, viewing, and representing look like, what the roles are like in our classroom. And then finally, I have a little section on let students in on the secret. To me, we should be empowering our students to understand the role of language in learning, even from a very young age. It's amazing when we start to have those conversations, how empowering that is for them, right? And so for them to recognize the role of language as we're teaching. Now, when we dive into chapter 3, this is a long chapter, I'll tell you that, because there's so much here. So when I thought about planning, we're thinking about planning your year, your week, your lessons. Now, Stephen Covey, who you may be familiar with, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he said the key is not to prioritize what is on your schedule, but to schedule your priorities. And how true is that, right? And so when we're thinking about that planning, what I've done is I've taken sort of the big picture, and then I've zeroed in and given examples all the way through of what that could look like in our classrooms. So these are the various sections that you'll see in this chapter. You'll notice it starts with something that is maybe unexpected, but it's recognizing the emotion tied to literacy learning. Whatever grade you currently teach, I am sure that you have students who absolutely love reading, who love writing, but I'm also positive that you have students who are reluctant, students who are frustrated with literacy learning. And what we need to recognize in our planning is how are we going to reach all of those students, the range of emotions, the range of abilities, all of that is so critical. And so that to me is sort of the foundation before we get into the planning itself. There's a quote that I have in the book about humans first. It is essential that we're thinking about our students as humans and recognizing, that this is for some of them such a stressful ask when we're talking about literacy, when we're teaching them those literacy skills. So you'll see the year ahead, a weekly schedule, which we're going to talk about in a moment. I cannot do a session without talking about the gradual release of responsibility, so it's got to make its place known here as well. And then I do go through the structure of a mini lesson. And I find that when I work with teachers now in my role, when I do PD across the country, I work with small groups, I do all sorts of different things like that. This is actually an ask that I get quite often. Just last week, I was doing a session with teachers in the Yukon, and we were running through a sample mini lesson because we can mimic that structure over and over again. And that's something that we can do for both reading and for writing skills. So once we have sort of a structure in place, it can really help us in our planning. And then the other significant section here is the literacy stations. And to me, those literacy stations are that opportunity, and we look at the gradual release of responsibility, they're the opportunity for our students to practice those skills and strategies that we're teaching without our direct involvement. So they're practicing with their peers, sometimes maybe even independently, but that's typically, how I utilize the stations. And so I've broken them down. I've talked about, some different areas that you can embed into your classroom. There's lots of ways to do it. It's not that there's one right way, but I've given you some different options within the book itself so that you have those there. Now, I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about planning your week, just to show you. This was probably the strategy, I suppose I should say, that teachers appreciated so much. When I was a consultant, I would share, this is how I would plan my language arts. Instead of thinking about each of those individual lessons, from day to day, think about your week as a whole, and then it makes it so much easier. And the reason is because you can ensure all those strands are present each week. You can embed word study into the week in meaningful ways, connected to both the reading and the writing. You're going to have those regular opportunities for writing practice embedded right into your week. Typically, the ones that you see on the weekly schedule, which I'll show you an example of in a moment, are low stakes writing, and that's very intentional. It really simplifies your overall planning, makes your life easier, but also students will get to know the routine as well. And you're capitalizing on those, there's less sometimes instruction needed if this is the routine that goes from week to week. And then finally, that facilitates the gradual release of responsibility as well. So those weekly schedules to me are extremely powerful. And I have a couple of samples here to show you. If you have Literacy Leadership Matters, you will notice that they also have the schedules in that book, because I wanted administrators and literacy leads and consultants to be aware that it is a really important tactic that we can use in our classrooms for planning. So this one that you see on the screen, please keep in mind, it is only a sample, but this is for grade 1 and 2. And so within the book, all of these things are going to be explained, but just some of those key components that I know, instead of planning from day to day, I know this happens every Monday, this happens every Tuesday, and so on. If you look at Monday, for example, now this again is grade 1 and 2. Journal writing, you'll see there, I always start with journal writing. Some of you know my story about journal writing, which we don't have time to get into today, but it leads to the independent reading. And then we move into our morning message, and then our explicit lesson on phonics, maybe still the phonemic awareness, depending on what we're doing. I often group those, maybe you have calendar time as well, and they're sort of grouped together. And then I introduce new word wall words always on Monday. That too, I can talk for a whole day on if we if we had time. But all of these little pieces are explained in the book. And then the last part of Monday I wanted to show you is I always embed a mini lesson on Monday devoted to reading. Now, that's the way I did it. Like I said, it's not that this is the one and only way, but to use something like this sort of as that guideline can be so helpful. Then if we flip from Monday to Thursday, you'll notice I'm just going to show you on Thursday, there's a targeted mini lesson for writing on Thursday. So those two sometimes connect with each other, but one is when the reading takes the leading role and the other is where the writing takes the leading role. And then you can see sort of some of the other writing pieces that are embedded in each and every day. Okay, now for the grade 3 to 6, it would be similar. I have junior high teachers who have asked for a model something like this as well. So they tend to mimic what you see here. It's a little bit different for our junior high teachers because they have a limited amount of time. They, 40-minute blocks or things like that. But they too have found that if I capitalize on routine, it can be very, very powerful. Just the last thing that I'll mention here is that if you look at the bottom, both schedules had that reference to talk time. I put it on my weekly schedule to remind me that I need to have every, that oral language piece is happening throughout the day, not just in language arts, but every day in all subject areas. Now, when I've shared this with teachers, they've told me that it's a game changer. And in the book, you'll see that all of those things are explained fully. So, I'm just touching on them right now, but just to show you that you'll if you do decide that you want the book, all of these things are talked about. Even independent reading is an interesting topic that I have devoted a lot of time to in Literacy Instruction Matters, because it is such a critical component of our classrooms. But we need to make sure that we're doing it, but we aren't watching fake readers in our classroom. We are watching engaged readers in our classroom. And there are ways that we need to instructional moves that we need to make as a teacher to ensure that that independent reading time is valuable, and that's critical. Now, moving on to oral language, go back to James Britton, who I'm sure that you are familiar with. He said, "Reading and writing float on a sea of talk." And when we're thinking about the ways that we can use oral language in our classrooms, it's interesting, because if you look in the curriculum, oral language, two different areas, right? We have oral language that supports learning. So some of the areas that you see here: the art of questioning, the art of listening, oral language as a scaffold and as differentiation. Those components are all ways that we can support learning. On the flip side, we also need our students to be learning those oral language practices. So when it comes to using talk in our classrooms, there's many ways that we can have students talking to learn. Now, the simple turn and talk is the easiest structure. And if we're using it on a regular basis, even the classroom setup I talked about earlier should be conducive for turn and talk, right? And our students should be used to it. They should know what we expect when we say turn and talk, or think, pair, share, whatever it is. Some of you are familiar with the Kagan strategies, and I just put a little reference there, because that is another way to ensure that our students are talking to learn. Typically, those Kagan structures take a little bit more setup, just in terms of getting the students up and sometimes moving, but they can be fantastic for that very reason, right? Because it is a little bit of a change of pace. We can do inside circle, outside circle. We can do 2 lines. There's lots of possibilities there, but we do need to make sure that our students are talking. If you notice at the top there that those questions, if you think about your own class and you consider how many students are answering the questions you ask, when I'm in a room full of teachers, typically they'll say 3, 5, 4, somewhere in there. And I almost guarantee you that you have a specific number in mind as well. And usually you can name those students, because it's always the same. What we have to ensure is that all of our students are talking to learn. If it's only those 3 to 5, then we're not leveraging oral language in the way that we need to. You'll notice that as your students get more comfortable turning and talking to a peer first, when you do bring the conversation back to the whole class discussion, what you'll find is that some of those students who weren't willing to take risks initially might be more willing, because they've now had the opportunity to talk it through with a peer, right? And sometimes that's all the confidence they need, and especially if they're doing it on a regular basis. Now, as I said, on the flip side, we also need opportunities to practice oral language. And so curriculum deals with both, right? Oral language to support learning, but also, how are we improving oral language? So I focused on these areas here: the presentations, the choral reading, the debate, and honoring some language traditions that we have. Now, we're not going to go into detail for them today, but they all have specific advantages. And the more comfortable we get our students in these situations, the better. The earlier on, the better. I have many colleagues over the years who were nervous speaking in front of their peers. And what we want is to get students so used to it that it's second nature to them, that it's not not meant to be intimidating. It's meant to be a learning process, but also, as we said earlier, a way of sharing, a way of connecting with each other, shared stories. All of those things can occur when we're thinking of these opportunities for practice. Now, word study is another hefty chapter, let's say that. And we're talking about that. I like this quote, although I'll tell you, it has nothing to do with language, but I thought it was so appropriate. Respect the building blocks, master the fundamentals, and the potential is unlimited. And I see this chapter as one of the key chapters in terms of supporting you in the classroom. This is where some of the concepts that we talked about very early on that I had just listed there, where we go through what is orthographic mapping, what is morphology, how do I teach it? We go in depth about phonological awareness and phonics, and these building blocks are so critical for our students in both their reading and their writing, that if we skip, let's say, to the reading chapter and think we're going to get it all there, we're not, because it's so critical. They're so entwined with each other. So to me, this is one of the most essential. Now, look at all of the things that are included within this chapter. Interestingly enough, we do start actually talking with the very basics, but we get into the reading wars. So the reading wars are here rather than in the reading chapter, because we're talking, for example, about the pendulum swing that phonics has taken over the years. And so that's all included here, providing us with some research, some background information, and then, obviously the practical side of it. What do I do based on what the research is telling us? So I'm very passionate about all of these things. You'll notice even the section on spelling tests, and that too I have very strong opinions about. Now, when we think about those ABCs, one of the things I just wanted to point out is that, we sometimes think that it should be relatively simple. If you've never taught in a primary classroom, you think, how hard can it be? And then those of us who have taught in a primary classroom are thinking, it's one of the most challenging things we can possibly do, right? There's a quote that I didn't include, that teaching reading is rocket science. It's so complex, but just look at these stats and we'll see why, or this information and we'll see why. We know there's 26 letters in our alphabet, but those 26 letters combine to create 44 different sounds. And then, as Denise suggests, those 44 sounds can be spelled 75 different ways, 27 of which make more than one sound. So even when we think about, the basic alphabetic principle and our beginning phonemic awareness, let's even start there, right? Leading into our phonics, it is complex. And so we need to recognize that. And I think it gives us a better understanding of our students and what they're going through when we think about how complex what we are asking them to do actually is. Now, I also just wanted to mention about morphology. So Louisa Cook-Moats has said, knowing morphemes enhances reading comprehension, word recognition, vocabulary, and spelling. That morphology piece links so many of those other strands of literacy together. And some of you know that I have been working on the Bug Club morphology with Pearson as well. And it was really eye-opening to me. I mean, I thought I knew a lot about morphology, and then I dove into that project and I realized that first of all, it's more powerful than I even realized when I was, researching, but also how influential it is when we bring those practical strategies right into our classroom. And so this chapter deals with that as well, and talking about how relevant it is, yes, for our young ones, but even more so as we go up the grades. Now, I wanted just to take a moment to show you the active view of reading, which you may be familiar with from Duke and Cartwright. So this was developed in 2021, and it builds on, you may be familiar with the simple view of reading. You may also be familiar with Scarborough's reading rope. And so there's similarities there with all three models, because we have the word recognition and the language comprehension. But when you look at, this is meant to describe how we achieve skilled reading. And if you look at all of the things involved in word recognition and language comprehension, what I wanted to point out is that importance of that word study in all of these different sections. If you look at the bridging processes, which is one of the additions that Duke and Cartwright included here, when you look at the active view of reading, you see some of those things that we were talking about in this chapter, the vocabulary, the morphological awareness, those kinds of things. We're also talking here about the active self-regulation. All of these things are so critical. And so even though, you may be thinking about, how do I improve the readers in my classroom? What you will want to do is really go basic, go think about those foundational skills involved in word study. That's probably going to be a starting point, right? Because even if it's language comprehension, the building of content knowledge, background knowledge, all of those things, it is connected to our word study. Now, then we move into reading, and Wiley Blevins, whose work you may or may not be familiar with, but fantastic work, in particular with the phonics. But he says reading is a gift, and as educators, we bear the responsibility and honoring of delivering that gift. And I wholeheartedly agree with that, because it is a responsibility and an honor. We certainly do not want our students leaving our classrooms and then finding themselves one day sharing a literacy in tears with someone, right? We want them to have those skills by the time they walk out of our room. And so I do see it as a great responsibility, but also that honor. Now, in this chapter, what we're going to talk about is that developing reader identity, the power of literature. You know anything about me, that's one of my favorite topics. Fluency, comprehension, those instructional practices to support reading, the reading assessments, and then re-examining some traditional practices. And I think that's essential that we consider. Now, Marianne Wolfe has said reading is one of the single most remarkable inventions in history. And I think it's so interesting when we look at it like that. But I would also say the teaching of reading is equally remarkable. And so we do require that background knowledge and skill in order to know how to do it the best that we can. Think about everything going on in the brain of a skilled reader, right? All of these things that I've listed on the screen. No wonder it's so complex. But we also recognize that reading is both a cognitive and an emotional journey. This is Donalyn Miller, and you may know her work as well. And so when we think about it, we obviously must teach the students this complex skills involved in reading, but it's not enough. They also need to find that joy in reading. And if they don't find that joy, then they're not going to be able to practice those skills because they're not going to be reading. So I always say that it's I see it as a challenge to engage all of my students in reading and to find something that every single one of them is going to feel confident reading, but also enjoy reading. Now, when we move to writing, Isaac Asimov said, writing to me is simply thinking through my fingers. Now, this is an interesting quote because he makes it sound like it's a simple like to him it comes naturally, right? But we know for students it's not true. But I actually agree that it is through thinking through our fingers. And I've had students who have sort of expressed that same sentiment when we've been writing. Now, I find that writing is absolutely a mindset. And when we have students who say, I don't know how or I can't, we have to figure out how to change their I can't into I can. And I believe it's on us. And I was doing a writing residency in the last couple of weeks, and I heard this. If any of you read my blog in the last couple of weeks, you would have seen that I've heard this sentiment from quite a number of students who said, I don't know how I can't. And you know what? They can, but they need our support, our scaffolding, our encouragement. It is up to us to change their mindset so that they see that it's something accessible to them, but it doesn't always come naturally. Now, in this chapter, we have all of these different areas. My first two books obviously are all writing, about writing, but we do have a bit of a summary here so that, we do get that sense of what does it look like in conjunction with all of the other pieces in our classroom. Now, moving on to literacy in the content areas as chapter 8, Barack Obama has said reading is that gateway skill that makes all other learning possible. And it's so true, right? Like, how do we move forward in any subject area without having that skill in place? And I'll tell you, this chapter begins with the power of integration and the authenticity that comes when we integrate, the authenticity of using language to learn in those moments. And this is one of my big regrets as a teacher, is that I didn't capitalize on integration enough as an elementary teacher. I had that opportunity in front of me, and I did it a little bit, but I certainly did not do it enough. And so this chapter, I think, is also very powerful when we're thinking about those other subject areas. How do I capitalize on these structures, these strategies, the various skills that we're teaching in science, in math, whatever it happens to be, to help our students construct meaning? And that's ultimately what we want them to do. And so this chapter goes through some of that. There's lots of examples. So you see I just pulled a few things just to show you some of the practical strategies. So everything from concept circles, which support vocabulary, using images, all the power of images in so many ways. It can be front loading. It can be vocabulary building, background knowledge, all sorts of things that it can accomplish, but also talking about structures like guided reading, morphology, writing to learn, and how those can support us when we're teaching content area as well. And chapter 9 is supporting literacy success for all. So now education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And here's the thing. We know that not all of our students come to us with those foundational skills in place. And there are going to be students who are struggling more than others. And so this chapter talks about how do we support those students, whatever the circumstance that has caused them to maybe not find as much success as their peers. It could be for a number of different reasons, but what do we do about it? And so we're looking at it in this way. I really do believe it is an antidote to poverty. Those aren't my words. I wish they were, but I do believe that very, very much. And I look at how do we avoid that blame game, forget about that altogether, and dive in and do the best that we can for these students. So as much as possible, obviously, we're going to try to prevent our students from getting to this point, but that's not going to be entirely possible. We're going to get students who come to us with some of the skills, a gap in some of those skills. And so then what do we do about it? And we say when intervention is necessary. And I always think about those 3 tiers of when we're thinking about instructional models, because sometimes we want to provide the intervention right in the classroom, to differentiate their instruction, to differentiate the tasks that they're working on, those types of things. And then what to do if, we still feel our students need even more support than that. Finally, chapter 10 is talking about our home literacy experiences. Now, I actually give parent literacy nights, which are really, really revealing. And I have changed the way that I've done them in the number of years that, since the time I started. At first, I think that I had an assumption that there were certain things that were common sense for our parents, and that I realized very quickly through the questions they were asking, not so much. Now, your job in the classroom is not to educate parents. Your job is to educate their children. But if we can do some, provide a little bit of information here and there, and even when I think about, whether it be a meet the teacher night, or whether it be a demonstration of learning, or an interview, whatever school district you're in and whatever process you use, those are moments when we can really educate parents about very, very, fundamental things that can be going on in their home. So when you look at the things on the screen here, it simple as reading aloud. Some parents believe that as soon as their child is able to read on their own, there's no need to read aloud to them any longer. And that simply just is not true. Also, the difference between what is home reading compared to read alouds, right? And the oral language piece. I once drove my friend's sister and her 2 at the time they were preschoolers, to an event. And it was out of town. So the 4 of us were in the car together. We drove to the event. We spent the day together, and then we drove home. And I was shocked at how little she conversed with her children, except functionally. There were some functional instructions she gave them, but they didn't know how to converse. Like, I tried asking questions and engage them in conversation. And sadly, they didn't know how. That wasn't something they were accustomed to. And so when I think about educating parents, this is one of those pieces that I emphasize with them. So like talk to your kids and play games like family game nights, but even just language games in the car, at dinner time. That can be so fundamental, and parents don't really realize all the skills that are involved in those moments, all the things that are happening in those moments. So that's just an example of some of the things that I like to do with parents. And I just wanted to share that those two boys that were in the car with me that day, years later ended up in the same elementary school where I was assistant principal. And guess who required some support with their literacy skills, with their reading in particular? And I wasn't surprised, right? But when we think about, okay, if we can get parents to be engaged and on our team, we're all on the same team. We all want the best for those students. If we can get all of us, doing some of those things that are going to support these students today and every day going forward, why not? Why not do that? So that's sort of the focus there. Now, honestly, you're here today, which shows that you have some interest in this area. But whether you're a brand new teacher, you're new to language arts, you're looking to strengthen your own teaching, or even to empower other teachers that you work with, I do believe very strongly in let's say instructional time matters, and the instruction that we take the time to plan and teach in our classroom really does make a difference for those students, because bottom line, that's who we're here for. That's why we chose this profession. And with that, I want to express my gratitude to you, because I always, I'm talking to teachers all the time. I'm talking to administrators all the time. And I believe that teaching is one of the toughest jobs that there is. And so I am so grateful that you expend the energy that you do. You come to something like this after work hours, but it just shows the dedication that you have to your students. And I'm so grateful. When I think about the world today and we think about all the things going on in the world, we need well-educated students leaving our classrooms. And you're a key part of that. So just to end with that, gratitude for you. Before we get to any questions that you might have, I just invite you, if you have other questions that come up at another time, always feel free to contact me through my website, which is wordschangeworlds.ca. You can also follow me on social media. I try on social media to post mentor texts and those kinds of things. I just got a new puppy a week ago, and so I had posted something about my new puppy, and someone had said I followed you because of your literacy posts, and now I want to see more about Charlie. So you might every once in a while get a photo or two of my new pup, who is Charlie. But generally speaking, it's all about those mentor texts and literacy instruction. So thank you for attending this evening. Lionel, did I miss any questions from the chat? Did you notice?
I don't think so. I think you captured most of it there, though I will point out to folks that you were saying much nicer things about your puppy than when you were trying to write, and said puppy was being distracted. So yeah.
Yes, I have a deadline of
That's
tomorrow
right.
for another project, and he was challenging me today.
That's great. That's great. Good, good. Yeah, there's some comments right at the end around your positivity, and I maybe just wanted to pick up on that a little bit. That, thank you as a fellow Pembroke author for carrying the vision forward about building resources for teachers to help them in the classroom. And as you said, they're there. We're all there, and we were there for students, and we loved the profession that we did. And the book, though, seems to cover so much, again, like a Pembroke book does. So I'm curious, there's sort of two parts to the question. And the first part is, do you read it in order? And if you do, is there a favorite chapter in there, a favorite activity? Like if I'm new and I like,
Yeah.
and you've sort of inspired me, where do I go with the book?
I mean, I would probably recommend reading it in order, just because everything is so interconnected. So like I mentioned, even if you're focused on the reading, you really want to improve student reading, so many of the other chapters are going to support that it's tricky to read it in isolation, because you'll find that things are referenced before and after. You certainly can, but I think it would be more meaningful to read from beginning to end. I've had teachers with the leadership book say the same sort of thing. They read it right through once, and then they flag certain things. In terms of what a favorite chapter, I honestly think that I would probably say that the planning chapter, I think teachers will find very useful. I'm hoping that the teachers find it very useful. And then also the word study, because that's an area that people often say that they're not always sure about all these terms that are surfacing and how to approach them. When we think about all the new curriculum across the country, so many of the terminology that's in the new curricular documents is in the word study chapter. So I think that too will really provide that support for people.
Perfect. That's great. And I know we're coming to an end, and you didn't touch on this, and I'm not even sure it's in the book, but with the passion around the reading and the writing, and maybe it doesn't apply as much at the elementary levels, but any quick thoughts on technology? And I spend all my time staring at this.
Yes.
I'm not. And what was I put up Isaac Asimov's, writing to me is simply thinking through fingers. I don't think doing this is thinking through fingers. So I just
there is a section on technology, actually, and it's referenced a few times. And actually, there's a couple of people in the chat that I just had this conversation with recently. Just the importance of, especially if we're in an elementary classroom, the importance of paper to pencil in those elementary classrooms, being cautious that we're not going completely paperless, that we are giving students the experience, especially when they're just those emerging readers and writers. So important. The research is actually very clear that it's going to activate all areas of the brain. Rather, when we're thinking about using our technology, it's a great tool. What would I do without my computer? And yet we also have to think about our students and their limitations at this point. So often if we're composing on a computer, for example, like composing text, generating new text, our students' lack of typing skills will get in the way as just a little minor example, right? They're looking for the J on the keyboard rather than thinking about what it is they want to write. So we do cover that. I do cover that within the book in a few different areas. Yeah.
Good. That's great. I'll just do a couple housekeeping comments here, and then I'll pass it over to you just to close us out this evening, Karen. But that was great. That was so good. So thank you so much. And the comments, you'll get a chance to look at them while I'm talking here. I think it's nice to have an hour together to be learning, but also to be celebrating a very hard job. But the successes happen every day. And so it's nice to come together for an hour and celebrate that as well. So folks, just a couple quick things. Within 24 hours, you should be receiving an email, and in there will be a link to the recording and a link to the slide deck so that you can get that information there. I'm also just putting out onto the screen right now an offer from Pembroke Publishers that if you go to our site, pembrokepublishers.com, and you see Karen's book there, you can, when you go to the checkout, you can put the code in LIM25, and that'll take $5 off your order of Karen's book. And so please feel free to use that. We would love to get this book into your hands. It is just literally hot off the presses. So Karen, with that, again, I'll say thank you so much for the last hour. It flew by, and your passion, not only around literacy and education, but also taking the time to capture that on words, on behalf of everyone here tonight. Thank you so much. And I'll pass it over to you to close us out.
Thank you, Lionel. I just want to express my appreciation for those of you who had made comments in the chat as well. I do think that you do one of the most difficult jobs there is, and also one of the most important jobs. So thank you for everything you do on a daily basis, and make sure you spend some time enjoying the evening. And I just have to echo Lenore in the chat, who said, "Go Oilers." We have to end on a hockey note. So
exactly.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.